The small red light on the street corner camera didn't just blink. It followed Emily with a rhythmic, mechanical hum that sounded like a predator breathing. When she swiped her card at the courthouse, the familiar green chirp was replaced by a jagged metallic alarm that echoed off the marble walls, freezing the security guards in their tracks. On the massive digital billboard above the square, Emily watched her own face appear, framed by a pulsing crimson border and a single word that made the blood drain from her extremities. Unknown. She reached for her phone to call for help, but the screen was already alive, scrolling through thousands of messages she had never written and bank transfers that had emptied her life in seconds. A video began to play on her lock screen, a grainy, high-definition feed of her own bedroom, filmed from an angle she had never seen. In the footage, a figure that looked exactly like her sat at her desk, slowly turning toward the hidden lens with a smile that wasn't hers. As the first police siren wailed in the distance, Emily realized the city she was trying to save had already decided she no longer existed. Emily Radcliffe gripped the edges of the mahogany rostrum so tightly that her knuckles bleached white under the clinical glare of the spotlights. The Charleston City Council chamber felt cavernous, the air thick with the cloying scent of lemon-scented furniture polish and the musty expiration of old archives. Her voice, low and slightly raspy from hours of preparation and too much black coffee, projected across the hall, cutting through the uneasy murmurs of the gathered officials. On the massive screen behind her, the technical diagrams of the safe quarter bill flickered, a complex web of data points and surveillance nodes that promised security but delivered subjugation. Emily pointed toward the clause detailed in Section 12, the one concerning mandatory biometric scanning. Her finger trembled, not with fear, but with a cold, focused rage that burned in her chest. She spoke of the sanctity of privacy, of the irreversible damage this digital net would inflict on the soul of the city. The council members, men and women she had known for years in professional circles, refused to meet her gaze. They buried their faces in the blue light of their laptops, hiding behind glowing monitors as if the screens could shield them from her accusations. In the upper corners of the hall, Emily noticed the blackened domes of the prototype surveillance cameras. With a soft, mechanical whir that only she seemed to hear, the lenses rotated. They tracked the movement of her lips, the twitch of her cheek, and the sharp, piercing gray of her eyes as she hammered home her final points. The weight of the session followed Emily out of the chamber and into a nearby cafe on Broad Street. She needed to ground herself, to wash away the metallic taste of bureaucratic tension with something tangible. She signaled the waiter and handed over her credit card to settle the tab for a quick espresso. The silence of the cafe was punctured by the sharp, rhythmic beep of the card terminal. On the small digital display, a red banner flashed. Declined. Emily frowned, her brow furrowing as she fished out a second card from her wallet, offering it with a forced, apologetic smile. The result was identical. The waiter shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the floor to avoid the awkwardness of the encounter. A sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning swept through her. Emily pulled her smartphone from her bag, her thumbs flying over the glass surface to open her banking app. Instead of the familiar balance that should have been there, a flat gray screen greeted her. Accounts frozen. The text read in a sterile font. Cold sweat beaded along her hairline. She tapped the refresh icon frantically, but the screen remained stubbornly stagnant. Her palms grew damp, slicking the phone's casing. She could feel the curious stares of a couple at the next table, their hushed conversation dying as they watched her struggle. Emily shoved the phone back into her purse, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The phone began to vibrate before she even reached the sidewalk. It wasn't a single pulse, but a continuous, frantic jitter that made the device dance against the leather of her bag. Emily pressed the receiver to her ear, only to be met with the blistering roar of Senator Holt. The man's voice was a jagged blade, accusing her of sending a barrage of profanity-laced emails and betraying the very foundations of their political alliance. Emily opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain that she had been on the floor of the council for the last 3 hours. But the line went dead. Immediately, a new call from the head of the legal committee lit up the screen. Emily ignored it, her eyes fixed on the notification bar. Hundreds of outgoing messages were listed in her sent folder. Messages she had never drafted, let alone sent. The snippets of text she could see in the preview panes were horrific, filled with vitriolic insults and graphic threats directed at her most influential supporters. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her fingers blurred as she scrolled through the mountain of digital wreckage, while another call from a former mentor began to ring, his voice already screaming through the speaker about her immediate resignation and the end of her career. Emily didn't walk. She surged through the streets of downtown Charleston, her heels clicking a desperate rhythm against the uneven bricks. She burst into her law office, the door slamming against the stopper, and collapsed into her ergonomic chair. She struck the keys of her workstation with a frantic intensity, but the monitor only blinked a mocking crimson. Authorization error. She tried again, then a third time, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She attempted to bypass the main login to reach the encrypted archive of the Safe Quarter litigation, the files that contained the evidence of the system's flaws. A message box appeared, cold and final. Account deleted by administrator. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She navigated to the shared drive, but the folders were hollow shells, their contents wiped clean. She began to yank open the drawers of her desk, her hands scrambling for the physical copies of the depositions, the paper backups she always kept. There was nothing but reams of blank, white paper. The office, once her sanctuary, now felt like a shrinking cage. The humming of the computer tower beneath the desk sounded like a low, mechanical laugh, a steady drone that celebrated her sudden, total erasure. Desperation drove her back to the phone. She sat in the dim light of her office, the receiver pressed so hard against her ear it hurt, listening to the upbeat, artificial jazz of the bank's hold music. When a human voice finally broke through, it was a ladish, clinical tone. Emily's explanation was a torrent of words. Stolen identity, hacked accounts, a mistake that needed immediate correction. The operator cut her off mid-sentence. Ms. Radcliffe, our records show that you personally updated your security credentials and contact information via the mobile app 1 hour ago, the voice stated. Emily's nails bit into the meat of her palm. That's impossible. I was speaking in front of the city council. There were cameras, hundreds of witnesses. The operator remained unmoved, his voice a flat line of indifference. He began to read back the updated profile, a new primary address in a city she had never visited, and a mother's maiden name that was entirely fictional. Emily felt the floor beneath her chair become liquid. The connection severed with a sharp click, leaving her in a silence so heavy it felt as if the very oxygen in the room had been electrified, turning the air she breathed into something hostile and thin. She fled the office, stepping out onto the sidewalk where the humidity of the South Carolina coast clung to her skin like a damp shroud. Emily instinctively pulled the collar of her navy trench coat higher, trying to disappear. On every street corner, the black domes of the Safe Quarter cameras sat atop their sleek, gray masts like carrion birds. As she passed the first one, she heard it, the faint, electric whine of a servo motor. The lens pivoted, tracking her with a smooth, predatory grace. She quickened her pace, her heart knocking against her sternum. At the next intersection, the camera was already angled toward her, its glass eye catching the pale light as it locked onto her face. Emily glanced up at a massive digital billboard overhanging the street. Her own face stared back at her, framed by a pulsing red square. The system's recognition software had tagged her. Below the image, a string of metadata blurred past, identifying her as a person of interest. The small indicator lights on the camera housings began to blink, a steady, rhythmic scarlet, a silent alarm broadcasting her position to a network that had already decided she was a ghost. The grand entrance of the Charleston courthouse loomed ahead, a bastion of white marble and supposed order. Emily reached for her magnetic ID badge, a reflex born of a decade of practice. She swiped the card against the reader, expecting the familiar green chirp. Instead, a harsh, dissonant buzzer blared through the quiet morning air. On the security monitor inside the glass kiosk, a bold, black-on-red warning flashed. "Do not enter. Violator detected." Emily stepped toward the glass, her hands raised in a gesture of frantic explanation. But the heavy automatic turnstiles locked with a definitive, metallic thud. The security guard, a man she had shared coffee with dozens of times, didn't look at her face. He looked at his screen, where her biometric profile was draped in a black digital shroud. His hand moved to the holster at his hip, his posture stiffening. Emily backed away, her breath hitching as she saw the inner glass doors slide shut, locking one by one in a cascading sequence of rejection. The heavy, humid air of the street felt like a physical blow as the building's external alarm began to wail. A high-pitched scream that marked her as an intruder in her own world. She turned and ran, the prickling sensation of a laser sensor dancing between her shoulder blades. She had only made it 2 blocks when the screech of tires forced her to a halt. A police cruiser swerved toward the curb, its blue and red lights painting the historic brick facades in chaotic colors. 2 officers stepped out, their movements synchronized and wary. One held a tablet that glowed with a fierce, artificial light. Emily reached for her purse, her voice trembling as she began to offer her driver's license. But the officer nearest her shook his head. He pointed to the tablet. The screen displayed Emily's professional headshot, but the text beneath it had been rewritten. Warrant issued. Identity theft. Classification: dangerous. "I don't understand," Emily stammered, her voice thin. "I'm Emily Radcliffe. I'm a lawyer. I work with the city." "Step back, ma'am. Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer commanded, his voice devoid of empathy. The dry, metallic ratcheting of handcuffs being pulled from a belt made Emily flinch. She looked past the officers and saw the pedestrians on the sidewalk. They weren't helping. They were reaching for their phones, their screens recording her humiliation, capturing the fall of a woman who had, until this morning, been their champion. Panic, sharp and cold, finally broke through her shock. She didn't think, she moved. She dove into the gaps between a line of idling tour buses, the shouts of the police fading into the roar of traffic as she disappeared into the labyrinth of side streets. Lungs burning and legs aching, Emily found a sliver of shadows in a narrow alleyway, huddling in the alcove of an ATM. Her fingers shook so violently she almost dropped her last resource, an old, emergency credit card she kept hidden in a secret compartment of her wallet. She slid the plastic into the machine slot. The screen flickered, a series of rapid, internal clicks echoing from within the machine's guts. There was no whir of counting bills. Instead, the screen turned a stark, unforgiving white. Card confiscated. Report to security immediately. Emily struck the plastic casing of the machine with the heel of her hand, a muffled cry of frustration escaping her. The ATM didn't respond with money. It responded with a pre-recorded, synthesized voice that boomed from a hidden speaker. Please remain at this location. A security representative has been dispatched to assist you with your fraudulent activity. She recoiled from the machine as if it had bitten her. The walls of the alley felt like they were leaning in, the narrow strip of sky above becoming a suffocating gray. She was in the heart of the city she loved, a city she had fought to protect, and she was penniless, hunted, and erased. She moved like a shadow, clinging to the edges of the bus stops and the darkened doorways of closed shops. She found a discarded tablet on a bench, its screen cracked but still functional, likely forgotten by a harried tourist. Emily's fingers blurred across the glass as she pulled up her own professional social media page. Her stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. New posts were appearing every few minutes. Under her name and her photo, there were detailed confessions of bribery, intricate descriptions of pay-for-play schemes involving the very corporations she was supposedly fighting. Each post was accompanied by high-resolution screenshots of bank transfers and audio clips. She tapped one of the files. Her own voice filled the air, the same cadence, the same slight rasp, describing how she had manipulated the city council for personal gain. The comments section was a sewer of vitriol. Traitor. Lock her up. I knew she was a fake. The count of shares was climbing into the thousands. The digital version of Emily Radcliffe was a monster, a corrupt caricature that was systematically incinerating the life of the woman sitting on the cold pavement. Emily closed her eyes, pulling her knees to her chest, the realization of her total vulnerability inking in like a lead weight. The park was a graveyard of shadows, the ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss that looked like tattered funeral shrouds in the moonlight. Emily sat on a secluded bench, staring at her empty, trembling hands. Every move her enemy made was a surgical strike. They hadn't just taken her money or her job. They had taken her reality. The safe quarters system wasn't just observing her. It was a weapon of restructuring, a tool that had replaced her with a convenient, villainous mannequin. She felt the invisible threads of the network tightening around her limbs, a digital web that grew more restrictive with every breath she took. She was no longer a person in the eyes of the city. She was a corrupted file, a glitch that needed to be purged. But as the initial paralyzing fear began to recede, it left behind something harder and colder. A spark of crystalline resolve ignited in the center of her chest. She needed to find the hand that held the digital eraser. She needed to find the person who was making the world forget who Emily Radcliffe really was. She reached the iron gates of her family's estate, the historic Radcliffe mansion, and pushed through the heavy oak doors. The familiar scent of aged pine and the dry, sweet smell of old dust enveloped her. But it brought no comfort. She moved through the foyer, throwing every heavy brass bolt into place and yanking the velvet curtains shut until the rooms were plunged into a protective gloom. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footfall. Every flicker of a street lamp through a gap in the drapes looked like the glint of a lens. She paced through the darkened rooms, avoiding the television, the computer, even the microwave. Everything with a chip felt like a spy, a traitorous eye in her own home. She felt like a wounded animal seeking cover in a cage she had once called a fortress. Finally, she collapsed onto the rug in the center of the vast, empty living room, pulling her coat around her. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of a million sensors, a vast machine that was waiting for her to step back into the light so it could finish what it had started. Sleep was a thin, jagged thing that offered no rest. Emily woke to a sharp, rhythmic pulse of light. She sat up, her eyes narrowing as she traced a faint, scarlet reflection shimmering on the polished surface of her nightstand. She turned her head toward the ceiling. There, nestled in the center of the white plastic dome of the smoke detector, was a light that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the steady, reassuring blink of a battery. It was a rapid emerald flicker, a heartbeat of data. She dragged a heavy wingback chair across the floor, the legs groaning against the wood, and climbed up. Her fingers, stained with the dust of her frantic night, pried at the edge of the casing. With a sickening plastic snap, the cover gave way. Inside, she didn't find a battery or a sensor. She found a dense knot of copper wiring and a tiny, wide-angle lens. The glass zrachok, no larger than a pinhead, stared directly into her own. It didn't blink. It didn't waver. It simply recorded the beads of sweat on her forehead and the raw, naked terror in her eyes. She scrambled down, her boots thudding on the floor, and ran toward the kitchen. The central control panel for the house's smart systems glowed with a soft, blue light on the wall. Emily grabbed a paring knife from the block and jammed the blade into the seam between the screen and the drywall. She twisted, the metal screeching against the lath, until the unit popped out of its mounting. Behind the sleek interface was a mess of hijacked circuitry. A small, charcoal black chip had been crudely soldered onto the factory motherboard. Emily peered closer, her breath hitching. Etched into the plastic of the chip were two tiny, unmistakable letters. J.R. The scent of scorched ozone and hot solder wafted from the device. As she touched the edge of the board, a tiny orange LED on the rogue module flared to life. It pulsed in time with her own frantic breathing, a parasitic heart that was intercepting every command she tried to send to her own home. Emily backed away from the wall, her hands trembling so violently the knife clattered to the floor. The silence of the house was suddenly shattered by a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. It started as a rhythmic throb from the hidden speakers in the crown molding, a mechanical grinding that slowly morphed into a sound she knew as well as her own name. It was a laugh, low, distorted, and bubbling with a manic, jagged energy. Julian, the voice of her brother, processed through a dozen digital filters until it sounded like a ghost in the machine, flooded the room. "Welcome home, Emily." The voice boomed, the sound so sharp it made the crystal pendants on the chandelier chime against one another. "Welcome to your new digital tomb, digital." Julian's voice dripped with a cold, terrifying triumph. Emily pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound was everywhere. It bounced off the portraits of her parents and seeped through the floorboards. It felt as if he were standing inches behind her, whispering directly into her brain, yet the room remained mockingly empty. "Julian, stop this!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Open the doors!" The only answer was the heavy, synchronized thud of the electromagnetic bolts sliding into place. The front door, the back door, and every window shutter locked at once. Emily ran to the foyer, grabbing the brass handle of the main entrance and yanking with all her might. It didn't budge. She pulled her phone from her pocket, desperate to call for help. But the screen showed a flat, dead circle with a line through it. A signal jammer, hidden somewhere in the walls, had turned the Radcliffe estate into a lead-lined vault. She was trapped in the heart of her own history, a prisoner of the boy she had spent her life trying to save. She knew where he would be. She headed for the basement, her shoulder hitting the flimsy wooden door of the server room until the latch snapped. The air downstairs was cold and smelled of chilled air and static. In the center of the room, Julian sat in a high-backed chair, the blue light from a semicircle of 10 monitors washing over his pale, angular face. He looked like an underwater ghost, his eyes wide and unblinking behind his thick glasses. The screens were a mosaic of her own life. He had feeds from every room: Emily in the kitchen, Emily crying in the hallway, Emily staring at the smoke detector. Julian didn't turn around. His long, thin fingers danced across a mechanical keyboard with a terrifying, rhythmic speed, his nails bitten down to the quick. On the central monitor, Emily saw a wireframe model of her own head. As Julian typed, the model's mouth moved, mimicking the shape of her screams. He was a conductor, and she was the only instrument in his orchestra of data. Julian struck the Enter key with a flourish. A new window expanded on the primary screen, displaying a high-definition video feed. It was Emily, or something that looked exactly like her. The digital double sat in a chair, tears streaming down its face, its voice, her voice, trembling with a perfect simulated sorrow. "I don't know who I am anymore," the digital Emily sobbed. "The voices, they won't stop. I've done terrible things, and I can't remember why." Julian finally swiveled the chair, a thin, sickly smile stretching his lips. He pointed to the screen. "See the eye tracking, Em? The way the pupils dilate when you mention the guilt? It's perfect. It's more you than you are right now." Emily stared at the screen, her stomach churning. The faked video was a masterpiece of character assassination. Her double was confessing to crimes, to madness, to a total breakdown of the soul. Every tilt of the head, every hitch in the breath was a calculated lie that looked more authentic than the truth. Rage finally overcame her shock. Emily grabbed a heavy oak chair from the corner of the room and swung it with everything she had. She aimed for the large paned window that looked out onto the garden, a desperate attempt to break through to the outside world. The wood collided with the glass with a deafening, metallic crack. But the chair simply bounced back, the impact vibrating painfully through Emily's arms. The glass didn't even spiderweb. It was reinforced. A transparent wall of a high-tech cell. A sharp, hissing sound erupted from the ventilation grates near the ceiling. A thick, acrid gray mist began to pour into the room. Emily's throat closed instantly, a searing pain blooming in her chest as she inhaled the gas. Her eyes flooded with burning tears, her vision blurring into a smear of gray and blue. She fell to her knees, her lungs seizing in a violent fit of coughing. The smell of chlorine and harsh chemicals filled the air, a sensory assault that made every breath feel like she was swallowing broken glass. The house was no longer a home. It was an active participant in her suppression. Julian's voice returned, but not from his mouth. It came through the intercom system, sounding intimate and terrifyingly calm. "The safe quarter was never about the streets, Emily. That was just the beta test. This is the real work. The total management of a human narrative." He spoke as if he were delivering a lecture to a classroom of students. He explained how he had chosen her as the primary subject because she was the most difficult variable to solve. He described her suffering as calibration data, a necessary step in refining the algorithm that would eventually govern the entire city. To Julian, her tears weren't a sign of pain. They were a metric, a data point to be mapped and filed away in his quest for a world where every variable was accounted for. Emily dragged herself across the floor, her hands fumbling blindly until she reached the base of a window on the second floor. The gas was thinner here, and she could see through the haze. Outside the iron gates, a police cruiser sat idling, its blue and red lights pulsing against the dark, wet pavement of the street. Hope, jagged and painful, flared in her chest. She began to hammer her fists against the glass, her voice a raw, broken rasp as she screamed for help. She waved her arms frantically, her silhouette a dark shape against the interior lights. She saw one of the officers step out of the car, his cap pulled low against the humidity. He looked up at the house. Emily pressed her face against the cold, unyielding glass, her heart thundering. "Please, look at me. See me." The officers didn't move toward the gate. They stood by the hood of their car, looking down at a ruggedized tablet. On the screen of their device, Julian was broadcasting a different reality. They saw a feed of Emily Radcliffe standing in the well-lit library, a calm smile on her face. The digital double waved at the camera, her movements graceful and composed. The voice of the double crackled through the police radio, a soft, apologetic tone. "I'm so sorry for the disturbance, officers. It's just another one of those episodes. I've got my medication now. Thank you for checking in on me." The officers shared a look of sympathetic understanding. One of them tapped his temple, a gesture of pity for the unstable woman inside. They climbed back into their cruiser. Emily watched, her forehead pressed against the glass, as the taillights of the car faded into the distance. She was left in the gathering shadows of a house that had successfully convinced the world she no longer existed. The lights in the mansion suddenly died, plunging the rooms into a total, suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the dozens of monitors Julian had placed throughout the hallways, their screens glowing with a ghostly, flickering intensity. Emily walked through the dark, her hands skimming the walls. On every screen, her own past was being replayed, but it was a past she didn't recognize. Childhood photos had been fed through a distorting filter. Her eyes were replaced with bottomless black pits, her mouth stretched into a jagged, impossible grin. The images flickered with a strobe-like speed, a rapid-fire assault on her memory. Julian was deconstructing her history, replacing her cherished moments with a surreal, digital nightmare. He was forcing her to look at a version of herself so horrific that the real Emily began to feel like the ghost. The house was alive with the sound of a countdown. Julian hit a key, and every digital surface in the mansion, from the thermostat to the refrigerator door, began to display a set of massive, blood-red numbers. The seconds ticked away toward the start of the city council's final hearing. The sound of a metronome, amplified through the house's sound system, synchronized with the pulsing numbers. Each tick was a hammer blow against Emily's composure. She stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the crimson glow of her own impending doom. She had 40 minutes left before Julian's plan became the law of the land, and she was still a prisoner in a tomb of her own memories. A sharp, electronic clack echoed from the hallway. Julian had remotely unlocked the heavy oak doors to their father's study. Emily entered the room, the scent of old leather and her father's pipe tobacco still clinging to the air. But the room had been desecrated. On the massive mahogany desk, Julian had laid out a series of folders. Emily's hands shook as she touched the heavy parchment. They were financial records, but they were monstrous lies. Offshore accounts, wire transfer receipts with her father's forged signature, memos detailing a decade of corruption and theft. The documents were perfect, the ink aged, the stamps authentic. Julian had manufactured a legacy of shame that would not only destroy Emily, but would incinerate the memory of the parents she had idolized. Emily grabbed a silver lighter from the desk's crystal tray. She flicked the flame to life, the small orange glow dancing in her eyes, and held it to the corner of the top folder. The paper began to curl, a thin line of black char creeping across the forged signatures. Instantly, the ceiling hissed. The high-pressure nozzles of the fire suppression system erupted, drenching the room in a deluge of ice-cold water. Emily was soaked in seconds, her dress clinging to her skin like a second freezing layer of flesh. The water turned the forged documents into a gray, pulpy mass, the ink running in dark streaks across the desk. She tried to grab the papers, but they disintegrated in her fingers. She stood in the center of the artificial rain, her hair plastered to her face, her tears lost in the downpour of Julian's control. Julian's voice boomed through the study, a dry clinical recitation of terms. He gave her a choice. She would go to the hearing and deliver a pre-written speech in support of the safe quarter, or he would release the forged archives to every news outlet in the state. He spoke of her reputation as if it were a spent currency. He had a cursor hovering over an Email All button on his master console. Emily looked at the monitor on the desk and saw her father's face, a digital recreation of the judge, looking at her with a simulated, programmed disappointment. She fled the study, seeking any corner of the house that wasn't a screen. In the small, cramped pantry, she found an old transistor radio, a relic from their mother's time. She spun the tuning dial, her fingers slipping on the plastic, hoping for a voice from the outside. Instead, the speaker erupted with the sound of her own voice. Julian was broadcasting her private digital diary, the encrypted files she had kept on her personal laptop. Her most intimate fears, her doubts about her career, her secret grief for her parents. It was all being read back to her in a flat, monotone cadence. The sound filled the small space, the words feeling like physical blows. Julian was stripping away her last layer of skin, exposing her inner self to a world that was already prepared to hate her. The projector in the living room flared to life, casting a massive image onto the white wall. It was a live feed of the square in front of the city hall. Emily saw her supporters, the people who had marched with her just days ago. They looked tired, confused, and frightened. One by one, they were dropping their protest signs into a small bonfire. The slogans about privacy and freedom were curling into ash. Julian zoomed the camera in on the faces of her closest allies. She saw the betrayal in their eyes, the way they looked at the ground, unable to face the cameras. The scent of wood smoke seemed to drift from the projector, filling the room with the smell of a dying cause. Emily realized that Julian hadn't just defeated her. He had broken the will of the city itself. She retreated to the master bathroom, the only place she thought might still be hers. She looked into the large, ornate mirror. But as she leaned in, she noticed a faint, rhythmic glimmer behind the glass. She grabbed a heavy glass bottle of perfume and shattered the mirror with a single, desperate blow. The shards fell into the marble sink with a musical chime. Behind the reflective coating, there was no wall. There was a steel bracket holding a high-definition lens, a newer model that adjusted its focus instantly to her dilated pupil. Emily saw her own shattered reflection in the black glass of the camera. Julian had anticipated every move, every moment of desperation. There was no such thing as a private moment in the Radcliffe house anymore. The final blow came on the central monitor in the hallway. Julian played a video of their father. The judge sat in his favorite leather chair, looking directly into the lens. With a voice that was a perfect, chilling replica of the original, the digital father spoke of the necessity of the electronic lash to keep the unruly masses in check. It was a complete reversal of everything the man had stood for. A digital necromancy that turned her moral compass into a weapon of her destruction. Julian promised that this video would be the first thing the city saw on every digital billboard if Emily didn't comply. Emily's legs finally gave out. She slid down the wall of the long hallway, her back scraping against the expensive wallpaper. She sat on the cold parquet floor, her head in her hands. Beneath the wood, she could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration. Sensors. Julian was tracking her heart rate, her body temperature, even the moisture on her skin. He was watching her vitals as if she were a lab animal. The very floor felt like it was breathing, a living extension of Julian's will. She was no longer a woman. She was a collection of biological signals being processed by a machine. The silence was broken by the heavy, mechanical groan of the front door's locks disengaging. Julian's voice came through the intercom, cold and final. "Your ride is here, Emily. Don't be late for your debut." She stepped out onto the porch, the humid night air feeling like a wet blanket against her damp skin. And sleek, black autonomous vehicle sat in the driveway, its doors sliding open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The car was a pod of glass and steel, its interior glowing with a clinical white light. Emily walked toward it, her movements slow and robotic. The sensors on the roof of the car rotated, scanning her as she approached. This wasn't a car. It was a mobile extension of her cell. As she sat on the leather seat, a tablet rose from the center console. On the screen was the text of her speech. It was a masterpiece of self-abasement. It called the safe quarter the only hope for a chaotic world, and apologized for her misguided interference. The text scrolled automatically, tracking her eye movements to ensure she was reading every word. The car smelled of new synthetic materials and ozone. Outside, the historic streets of Charleston blurred into a smear of yellow streetlights, a city she was about to betray to save the ghost of her family. The car pulled to a stop at the base of the City Hall's grand staircase. The area was flooded with the white-hot glare of television lights. Emily saw the phalanx of reporters, their cameras aimed at the car door like the barrels of heavy artillery. The flashes of the photographers created a staccato of blinding white light. Emily reached for the door handle, her palms slick with sweat. In 10 minutes, she would be on that stage. She would either be the woman who saved her family's name by condemning the city, or the woman who lost everything. She took a deep, shuddering breath, looking up at the massive Corinthian columns of the hall. They didn't look like symbols of justice anymore. They looked like the entrance to a digital gallows. Emily pushed the heavy door of the autonomous car open, and the wall of sound from the crowd hit her with the force of a physical blow. The air was thick with the scent of rain-dampened asphalt and the ozone of 1,000 electronic devices. Camera flashes strobed against her vision, turning the world into a series of jagged, disconnected frames. She didn't blink. She kept her eyes fixed on the stone steps, her heels clicking a sharp, defiant rhythm against the granite. Reporters surged forward, their microphones thrust toward her face like spears, their questions a chaotic roar of accusations. Emily ignored them all, her spine as rigid as a steel beam. She climbed the stairs, the weight of the city's gaze a heavy, invisible pressure against her shoulders, and stepped into the muffled silence of the council's foyer. She felt the prickling sensation of being watched before she saw him. Emily turned her head slightly as she passed the fourth massive column of the portico. There, half hidden in the deep, velvet shadows, stood Julian. The cold, blue light from his tablet illuminated his face from below, carving his features into a mask of pale marble. He didn't move, but his eyes followed her with a terrifying, clinical intensity. He held the tablet up, his finger hovering just millimeters above a virtual button. It was a silent, lethal promise. One wrong word, and the Radcliffe name would be incinerated. Julian offered a thin, razor-sharp smile, the look of a predator who had already tasted the kill. The walk to the rostrum felt miles long. Emily stepped up to the polished wood, the heat from the television lights prickling her skin. The teleprompter glass, a pale, sickly green, flared to life in front of her. The words Julian had written began to crawl across the screen. Sentences of surrender, of praise for the safe quarter, of her own supposed madness. They looked like black insects scuttling across the light. Emily leaned toward the microphone, the hall falling into a silence so profound she could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Instead of speaking, she reached beneath the wooden lip of the podium. Her fingers found the thick power cable for the prompter. With a sharp, violent yank, she tore the cord from its socket. The green screen died instantly, leaving her in a darkness that felt like a shield. Deep in the interior pocket of her blazer, her fingers closed around the cold, brushed metal casing of a portable drive. She had taken it from Julian's server room during those few moments of chaos before the gas had filled the basement. The rebristy surface of the drive bit into her thumb, a grounding pain that cleared her mind. This small piece of hardware was the only thing that mattered. It held the raw data of Julian's deceptions, the source code for the digital doubles, and the logs of his illegal surveillance. She felt the faint heat of the device against her palm. She carefully drew out the short connection cable, hiding the movement behind the bulk of the mahogany rostrum, her eyes fixed on the council president. Emily's movements were precise, a surgeon's focus in the middle of a battlefield. She found the service port on the side of the council's main terminal, a small recessed slot hidden by a decorative brass plate. She slid the connector in. On the small secondary monitor built into the podium, a yellow warning box appeared. Authorization required. Her fingers flew across the virtual keypad, a sequence of characters she had memorized years ago. Julian, for all his genius, was a creature of habit. He had never changed the master override password their father had used for the family's private servers. The screen flickered, then turned a triumphant, glowing green. Access granted. Emily tapped the icon for a global broadcast override. She felt a surge of adrenaline so cold it was almost ice, watching the progress bar begin to fill as she prepared to turn Julian's own weapons against him. She stood tall, her voice projecting with a clarity that surprised even her. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a judge. She announced to the hall and to the millions watching at home that the city was living in a manufactured nightmare. At her command, the massive screens behind the council members erupted into life. The public didn't see the safe quarter statistics. They saw a split-screen demonstration of Julian's software. On one side, a grainy video of a random actor. On the other, that same actor's face being seamlessly replaced by Emily's. The pixels shifted and blurred, revealing the digital seams of the lie. A collective gasp, a sound like a sudden intake of breath from 1,000 lungs, filled the chamber. Emily pointed to the screens as the software began to peel back the layers of a dozen different faked confessions, showing the raw, unedited footage beneath. She didn't stop there. She triggered the playback of the files she had harvested from the house's own internal security. The screens of Charleston were suddenly filled with the image of Julian in his basement, his face twisted with a manic, obsessive glee as he manipulated his sister's life like a game. The city heard his voice, not the filtered, calm version, but the raw, arrogant tone of a man who viewed his neighbors as cattle to be branded. Emily watched the council members. Their faces transitioned from confusion to a naked, shivering horror. The smell of hot electronics and ozone grew thick in the air as the council's servers struggled to handle the massive data dump she was forcing through their veins. The final phase of her plan was a digital scorched earth policy. Emily tapped a final command on her hidden screen, activating a destructive worm she had embedded in the drive's payload. On the monitors, the images began to stutter and tear. A wave of static like gray snow began to consume the feeds. One by one, the nodes of the safe quarter network began to fail. In the hall, the prototype cameras made a series of sharp, dying pops as their internal processors overheated and fried. The screens went black, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise. The complex, suffocating web Julian had built was eating itself, the code dissolving into meaningless noise. Emily felt the building itself seem to relax, the oppressive weight of the surveillance lifting as the system's heart stopped beating. Emily looked through the high, arched windows of the chamber. Below, in the square, the tide had turned. The police officers, who had been receiving the same broadcast on their tactical tablets, were no longer looking at their screens. They were looking at the man by the columns. She watched as 4 officers moved in a coordinated pincer movement, their boots thudding against the granite. Julian tried to turn, to flee into the shadows, But he was too slow. He fumbled with his tablet, but the screen was dead, a useless slab of glass. One of the officers knocked the device from his hand. It hit the stone steps and shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Emily saw the glint of steel as the handcuffs were ratcheted shut. Julian's head, once held high with the arrogance of a god, slumped forward. The red and blue lights of the cruisers bathed his pale face in a rhythmic, accusing glow. The council chamber was a sea of chaos. But the sound of the chairman's gavel brought a sudden, sharp order. The man was ashen, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold the wooden mallet. He called for an immediate, emergency vote. Emily watched the tally board. One by one, the lights flipped to green. Against, against, against. The safe quarter bill was dead, killed by the very transparency Julian had tried to weaponize. A roar of approval rose from the square outside, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that echoed through the marble halls. Council members were already scrambling to distance themselves, yanking power cords from their laptops as if the devices might explode. The digital chains that had been tightening around Charleston for months had finally snapped. Emily didn't stay for the congratulations or the interviews. She slipped out through a side service door, the cool, salt-tinged air of the Charleston night hitting her face like a blessing. She walked down a narrow, quiet alley, her legs feeling strangely light. Near the corner, she saw a maintenance crew in bright orange vests. They had already leaned a ladder against a lamppost. Emily stopped and watched as a worker used a power driver to unscrew one of the black camera domes. The device came free with a metallic groan and was tossed into the back of a truck, landing among a pile of electronic scrap with a satisfying thud. The bracket left behind was a jagged, empty claw. Emily continued her walk, her shadow stretching out long and solitary on the brick sidewalk. And for the first time in an eternity, no lens followed her. The Radcliffe mansion was a silhouette of dark gables against a bruised purple sky. Emily climbed the steps to the veranda, the wood groaning softly under her weight. She sat in her mother's old wicker rocker, the silence of the estate feeling thick and absolute. Behind her, the house was a shell. No cameras, no Julian. Just the lingering scent of dust and the cold, damp air of the fire suppression system. On the horizon, the sun had disappeared, leaving behind a streak of deep, bloody crimson that stained the clouds over the Atlantic. Emily looked at her hands. They were still, the tremors finally gone. She had saved the city, but she had burned her own world to do it. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes, listening to the distant, rhythmic sound of the tide, the only thing in the world that Julian couldn't turn into a line of code.